Hi, everyone. We're back with another edition of Bad News, the media criticism show the right deserves. I'm Emily Jashinsky.
And I'm Ben Weingarten.
As always, we're brought to you by The Federalist and by the National Journalism Center, where we're broadcasting from. Now, today's show is going to be focused entirely on something that deserves our entire attention, because there's never any accountability when the media botches things as badly as the Washington Post did not that long ago, actually, when audio came out in the Wall Street Journal last week that showed the Washington Post had botched a scoop. I'm going to put this up on the screen so you can see it. This is the original Washington Post headline. Quote, "Find the fraud." That is the first part of the headline. Trump pressured a Georgia elections investigator in a separate call legal experts say could amount to obstruction. Multiple other outlets, quote, confirmed that scoop. When the audio came out, it showed that Donald Trump did not say anything like, quote, "find the fraud." Those words did not come out of his mouth, though the Washington Post reported it based on anonymous sources. And then, crucially, several other outlets confirmed it. So there is a lot going on here. There is the reckless use of anonymous sources. There is the bad information that outlets get and then put forward as a factual rendering of the situation. And then there's, of course, the corporate press's just desire to do anything it takes to take Donald Trump down. Ben, what did you think about this story?
Yeah, I think you lay it out very clearly and concisely. And the only thing I'd add in terms of how widespread and detrimental the impact of this story is this was also referenced several times during the Kabuki impeachment theater that we witnessed. It is referenced in the kind of background information for the impeachment articles, and then it was also brought up as well in oral arguments. So it shows you once again, and one of the problems, and I don't really think that there is a simple answer for this, but the first lie that's told goes around the world 10 billion times before we actually get to the truth. And the consequences of that are just massive. I mean, the fact that falsehoods, fabricated quotes, make it into the impeachment proceedings itself, I think shows you just the extent of the danger of this sort of, it's not even shoddy journalism, because you have to view it as intentional to some extent. I mean, look, journalists know, and Mark Hemingway wrote about this really compellingly at The Federalist, so I urge everyone to check that out. And I'd say that even if I were not a senior contributor there, because it's a great article about journalistic malfeasance. With one source who hears about this secondhand, it appears that was the basis of printing this, and then other outlets as well are able to confirm from this questionable individual source. You don't print something like that about the president of the United States with one source like this. I mean, that's just ludicrous. So the fact that the media dispensed with any of the very basic tenets of journalistic practice that presumably at least one would learn in journalism school, although maybe not anymore, are gone. And I think, look, the New York Times itself said essentially, how do we cover Donald Trump? He's uniquely awful. We have to dispense essentially with our normal journalistic standards, and we have to be activists and partisans essentially here. And I think you saw that throughout the last 4+ years. I also think it points to the fact that in their animus towards the president, he actually exposed the fact that they don't adhere to their own standards when presented with someone that they view as sort of an existential threat to their agenda. And so I think and I wrote about this, what was Trump's greatest achievement as president? And I wrote in the American Mind about the fact that maybe the greatest achievement of all is that because of the animus that he drew in all of our leading institutions at the commanding heights, their response showed that they were corrupted, that they were politicized, that they themselves were destroying their own institutions. It wasn't Trump doing that, it was themselves. And so I guess this is another perverse, awful benefit of the Trump administration that continues to live on, which is that it's totally exposed the media for what it is, which is a communications arm of the ruling class, which was devoted to taking down a president, and which proved it in the infinite number of stories just like this, with almost no sourcing, thin sourcing, inadequate sourcing, where ultimately the bombshells turned out to be duds. And it happened repeatedly throughout the presidency, whether it's Donald Trump Jr. and WikiLeaks, or the reporting on the Trump Tower meeting with Donald Trump Jr., or the million other stories about shady meetings with the Russians. Obviously, Russian collusion gate itself being the kind of media corruption writ large illustration. But I think this example in particular just perfectly crystallizes what we saw over the last 4 years. And how many other stories were there exactly like this that we'll never know about?
Yeah, that's a key point. It's like Michael Cohen going to Prague. That was a story that I think McClatchy reported based on, again, really thin sourcing. I think they had like cell phone information that was unreliable in this case because Michael Cohen was not in Prague. And it's a good example right here. I mean, it's not even an example, it's a case study because they have, I'm just going to read the Washington Post's correction because it's kind of all in their correction. 2 months after publication of the story, the Georgia Secretary of State released an audio recording of President Donald Trump's December phone call with the state's top elections investigator. The recording revealed that the Post misquoted Trump's comments on the call based on information provided by a source. A source. A source. Trump did not tell the investigator to, quote, find the fraud. Now I'm going to pull up their original headline, quote, find the fraud. Instead, Trump urged the investigator to scrutinize the ballots in Fulton County, Georgia, asserting that she would find, quote, dishonesty there. I mean, oh my goodness. It's like they had a source who told them one thing. That source's quote gets put in the headline of a Washington Post exclusive. It's mind-boggling how editors at these newspapers that purport to be defending democracy from the darkness could take such, like the Washington Post does, by the way, it could take such a huge story and run with it attributed to a source like that. I don't actually think the legacy press used sources, anonymous sources this way before the Trump era. I think, maybe some other places did. I don't know that you could have gotten away with that at the New York Times or the Washington Post before the Trump era. And I think that just speaks to a desperation to get Trump on anything and this sort of willingness to lower the standards when it comes to Trump, not even consciously, but because they so believe everything they hear from these sources and they are used by them. We saw this in the Russian collusion hoax. They were used time and again by these sources.
Yeah, and even, for example, the Atlantic story about, Donald Trump and the military and how he mocked the military, or, how the Russian bounties. I mean, there almost every week of the Trump presidency, if you were to go back, and it really is amazing, even if you go back and look at the stories right after the inauguration in 2017, every single week there were anonymous sources, people in the national security close to a certain situation say. And then even when there were sources, people who were actually in the room, so often, of course, they spun stories. Look, I mean, the Steele dossier, obviously the reporting on it. It is remarkable to behold the awfulness that transpired in any given week. And I guarantee if you just pick out any random week during the Trump presidency, you can find about 10 stories exactly like this, where if it would be fascinating to actually ask the journalist, who did you reach out to? What can you provide justification for why you trusted these sources in the first place? But all of it goes back to something that we've talked about before, which is the notion of how the media treats due process. Due process is a pretty important thing to consider in journalism because you should obviously be skeptical of whatever is being spoon-fed to you. And you have a duty and an obligation when you have the power that a media outlet has, like the Washington Post has, to use that power responsibly. But to your point, obviously they haven't. You have to assume that if a quote sounds like it's too good to be true from the perspective of an anti-Trumper, which everyone in the media basically is and was, then you have to look at, okay, how can I actually prove this? And as Mark Hemingway actually noted in his article, maybe it was that whatever information was divulged to the writer or whatever was said on the call might have been bad enough and from the perspective of the Trump presidency. And so you'd have a story anyway. But the fact that they had to go and fabricate it, I think just speaks to how zealous they were as political actors in this. But the question of due process, you have to look at both sides. You have to judge sources from both sides of the argument. You have to get people to confirm it, or you can't print something like that. I mean, it's just basic journalism that anyone knows, whoever reads anything in the media. So I think it speaks to the level of corruption, how deep the rot is. And the question, again, always is, how is it that these media entities continue to operate as if they are paragons of truth and justice? Will there be any price that's paid? And again, I guess, look, the fact that a show like this exists speaks to the fact that a price does need to be paid and a price should be paid, that there are critics out there. But still, you look at it, I mean, I mentioned Mark, Glenn Greenwald has obviously written on this, maybe Matt Taibbi will as well. But look, I mean, the media continues on, and all of these other major outlets that glommed onto this story as well, like, what price are they going to pay for this? Is it that the audiences are such an echo chamber that they don't care and they just keep on trucking? You know, it's sort of like the Bill Clinton, or I guess the Andrew Cuomo model of, like, if you're going through hell, just keep going. No one's ever going to, you'll survive if you continue to fight it. Or will there be a price that's paid? It's sort of a rhetorical question, but it's also an open question. What do you think?
Well, so this is, I think, a great segue into the second half of this entire conversation, which is that there were other outlets that confirmed the scoop, because you just said it speaks to how deep the rot is, and that could not be more true than it is in this case, because it was not just the Washington Post. Now, look, we have a comment here from a viewer who asks, when the source is wrong, why isn't the source disclosed? And that's a fantastic question. And it's another question that, like, I've had on several reports when it comes to Russian collusion, because it is customary in journalism, if your source burns you and feeds you bad information, you burn the source. You say the person was lying to me and here's who they are, because you put a certain amount of trust in them. And that's how those relationships work. That's how sourcing relationships work. And it seems time and again, if you look at the Russian collusion narrative, if you look at all of these false narratives that were laundered through the corporate media over the course of the Trump administration, none of the sources were ever disclosed when the information seems to have gone wrong. I mean, rarely, if ever, were those sources disclosed when they were feeding bad information. And what happens is you have all of these people trying to have competing interests, trying to use the media to spin a narrative. And that is clearly what happened in this case. And so I actually find it baffling that a lie that blatant was not disclosed, but that's where it gets interesting. Beckett Adams at the Washington Examiner makes this really, really, really crucial point. You all are missing the real story, re WAPO's correction of its Trump Georgia investigations chief scoop. The real scandal is that a bunch of newsrooms claimed at the time they confirmed the details of the scoop with their own anon sourcing. And Beckett has a list right here. NBC News said it, quote, confirmed the Post's characterization of the December 23rd call through a source familiar with the conversation. USA Today, they say they confirm through a Georgia official speaking on the condition of anonymity to discuss internal matters, confirmed the details of the call. ABC News, quote, an individual familiar with the matter confirmed that Trump urged the chief investigator to, quote, find the fraud. That person confirmed the quote that we now know is false. They literally confirmed, quote, find the fraud. That right there is several major, major legacy news outlets with huge audiences that actually still have some basic trust, though they shouldn't, with millions and millions of readers around the country. So it's one thing for a source to launder a false narrative through one legacy media institution like the Washington Post. It is another thing entirely to have several different legacy outlets then confirm it. And it turns out from an audio recording that it's not true at all. What is shocking and frightening about that is when you have all of these outlets confirming a false story, how many times does that happen? And we have no idea because there isn't an audio investigation. How much information do we believe is true because it's been confirmed by several outlets, at which point all you have to do is, like, all you can do is believe it. When it's confirmed by several outlets, several big outlets with the resources, major editorial resources, it's stunning and it's frightening. And it makes no sense. And likely what happened is they all talked to the same person. And that's sort of the best case scenario. What do you think about that, Ben?
And also there's a level of flukiness to this as well, because my understanding is, and correct me if I'm wrong, but this audio recording was found in like the trash, an electronic audio document in the trash of this person's computer, and it was only by dint, I think, of a FOIA request potentially that it was even unearthed in the first place. I hope I'm getting the details of that correct, and the Journal probably has it in their article where they report on the recording. But there's an element of flukiness to this. I mean, this might never have come out had it not been for the fact that this recording was unearthed from the trash of this person's computer. So I'd also suggest that there's an analogy here to be drawn between the first impeachment, actually, because our viewers will remember that was essentially based on hearsay, opinion about calls that were made, about a call that was made with a foreign leader, how one person in the room or several people in the room interpreted what was said during a conversation was used as the basis of claiming high crimes and misdemeanors. And Colonel Vindman himself actually has been in the news recently. Again, he's speaking out, so I think it's apropos to raise it. But I guess what I would say is, look, our media is just following along with our political class. So I guess, you know, maybe they're just taking the cues from their betters, but also it shows that the lines between our politicians and our media have completely blurred, essentially, and that the media is just an organ of our ruling class at the end of the day. It's its communications arm.
Yeah, so they allow themselves to be used by the political class because they largely agree with the political class. And so when things confirm their narratives, they run with them without the level of skepticism they would apply if someone came and said, listen, Joe Biden said, quote, find the fraud. They would not have standards that low to get it. And we all know that because we know that all of these standards have been lowered in one particular direction. It's always in one direction. And so we know exactly what's going on here. I mean, it's no secret, but your point about how deep the rot is goes to your question about whether there will ever be accountability. And I think sadly, the answer to that is absolutely no. The only accountability, who's going to hold all of these 5 outlets that confirmed a false quote accountable? The only way to do that is market forces that allow other outlets, better outlets, to grow at this point. I mean, they're not going to be reformed from within. If anything, they're going in the opposite direction, right? If anything, we're seeing the creep of cultural leftism completely take over these newsrooms to the point where they're inefficient, they're hobbled, they can't actually do good reporting. They're distracted by their sort of cultural leftism to the point where it's like, they don't have any chance of getting better standards of reporting because that sort of ideology is actually making them lower their standards because it insists that there can be no such responsible thing as neutrality in the face of what they see as bigotry from every single person who disagrees with the dogma. So if anything, it's getting worse in the legacy media, and the only real solution is to empower and build up an infrastructure of new institutions and new media outlets, and to keep driving eyeballs more and more away from places like the Washington Post and to other outlets that are providing good information. Maybe it's even biased. Like maybe it's even, hey, we're openly conservative, take that as you will, but here's the information. And to me, I see that as the only possible solution, because we just went through a hell of a year with a pandemic where nobody knew what to trust because they were being told that masks were good, then they were bad, and then they were good. And the media was going along with this bad medical information being put out by the political class, the noble lies of Anthony Fauci. It's really unbelievable. And so nobody knows who to trust on important issues. It's not just that they don't know who to trust on whether this healthcare bill is good or bad, which is an important issue, but they also don't know who to trust on like practical, immediate questions of masks, on impeachment. I mean, it's just unbelievable the depths of the corruption in our corporate media, and the fact that so many outlets confirm this, I do think speaks to your question about whether there will be any accountability, and speaks to your point about the depth of the rot here.
Yeah, and I guess the only kind of coda I'd add to that is one of the themes that we've been pursuing on this show, basically from its very beginning, is that the media is also acting as activists to try to shut down dissenting views. That includes, for example, going after Substack and saying Substack shouldn't feature
Yes.
certain writers who are independent writers, and they were pushed to be independent writers precisely because they were rejected by the establishment media, precisely because they refused to go along with the political line of the establishment media. So I think that the corporate media rightly recognizes the fact that there could be competition out there, and that market forces could actually render them obsolete or discredit them, undermine them. If you even go back to sort of the advent of blogs, Dan Rather's career was sort of torpedoed in some respects because of his reporting on George W. Bush. We're talking a couple of decades back here. And I believe it was the Powerline blog that sort of unearthed the fact that actually this was shoddy reporting on George W. Bush's exploits on documents that Dan Rather reported on. So the media hates when anyone else out there can be media and can actually scoop them or call into question their reporting or purported reporting. And that is why you see, I believe, this entire effort, this massive effort from corporate media institutions to try to torpedo any dissenting voices, because obviously those dissenting voices pose a mortal threat to their business model.
We've gotten a couple of comments over the course of this show of people saying, this wasn't an error, this was corruption, this wasn't an error, this was intentional, et cetera, et cetera. I actually am going to push back on that because the way that this happens is that, and I have some insight into this, the benefit of having the disadvantage of living in Washington, D.C. The sort of silver lining of that is that I do, have an inside sort of glimpse at how these institutions and how these reporters work. They actually don't just fabricate things out of thin air. It's tempting to believe that they do because some of the stuff is so ridiculous and the corruption is so crazy. But the way that this actually happens is that people with axes to grind come to them and try to get some sort of false narrative into the paper so that they can build the narrative everywhere, or so that they can have something, a cudgel against someone. Like, this is what they do, is deliberately manipulate the media. And now that the media is more friendly to the political class, particularly the Democratic Party, than it probably ever has been, because they hate Donald Trump so much. So now that you have that relationship, they've lowered their standards of skepticism. And that's how stuff like this creeps in. It's somebody with an axe to grind against Donald Trump makes something up and then gives it to a reporter who should know better. And who should say, I can't run with one source because the one source could be making this up. So it's not like people are sitting around newsrooms and making details up. I promise you that's actually not what's happening. It's that other people, political actors, are people with like partisan goals or partisan organizations, whatever it is. They make stuff up. They bring it to the media, and because the media is friendly in one direction, they've lowered their standards of skepticism, and that's how these things sort of get into the press. And so I hope that that's sort of a helpful explanation of how these kinds of things happen. Like I said, it brings me no pleasure to say that I have some insight into how these legacy institutions work, but I do, and that's really the way that these stories, these totally false stories, end up being presented as a reasonable version of the truth in these outlets. And it's just like, it's such a mess. We don't know what's real and what's fake. And that applies to people who literally follow news for a living. I mean, when 5 sources confirm something in different outlets, you have to, at a certain point, you have to say, well, gosh, but not anymore, because we know they're all probably talking to the same person.
Yeah, it just speaks to the fact that as a viewer, you need to have utter and complete skepticism of any purported bombshell headline. But there's really no way to ultimately grapple with, or I think even consider, the full ramifications of the fact that when a story like this comes out, if it's not corrected until 2 months later, and oftentimes the correction doesn't get as much focus as this correction does, the narrative is set. It's already been, the seed has been planted in people's minds, And that is the power that the media has ultimately over the collective mind of the country. And it proves how devastating it has been to us. And of course, these are the same people in the media engaged, so suffering not just from Trump derangement syndrome, but also just a horrible case of projection. I say this not as a psychologist, but it's so, I mean, everything that they talk about, oh, we have to combat disinformation and dishonesty and false reporting and hoaxes and conspiracies and the like. But then our corporate media betters engage in the most perverse and devastating and damaging ones themselves. So to the extent we end up with a nation of conspiracy theorists, it's their fault because they started it.
Mm. That's so true. That's so true. And that was my big takeaway, sadly, after January 6th. And it's been my big takeaway after like riots. There's such a breakdown of trust in all of our institutions, and the media really, really fuels it. And they have had ample opportunity to correct that. I mean, if the host of Celebrity Apprentice being elected president of the United States isn't the wake up call that you need, and it doesn't force you to make a course correction. And if anything, you go worse in the other direction, there's literally no hope for the corporate press. It's an utterly hopeless institution, and the only solution is to build up new institutions.
Yeah. Only thing I'd add is if this is how they treated the president of the United States, imagine how they treat you and I and the millions of other Americans in this country. And you have to work under the assumption that essentially they are starting from a point of dishonesty and deception, or at least there is a high probability of it. And I guess maybe that's a good thing. Maybe it's a good thing that we're being trained to be skeptical and to read between the lines and to ask the basic questions that have to be asked when these stories are sort of breathlessly spun. But at the same time, it points to the corruption of our institutions. I mean, and sort of an analog to what we're seeing, and maybe we'll talk about it another time, with the whole Tucker Carlson Department of Defense contretemps that's going on. Tucker is getting attacked for being portrayed as attacking an institution, but the institution in its response is showing that the attack was warranted. So in every case, it's the institutions themselves that are burning themselves down and proving to us that we should be skeptical of them. So we're not at fault. The institutions are at fault, and they hate when those faults are pointed out. But it's imperative that we do so if we're going to ever get back to a place of actually having a cohesive society that has trust in these bedrock institutions. The only way to engender trust is to be open, transparent, admit your mistakes, and correct them. And instead, it feels like from all the commanding heights of society, it's all going in the opposite direction. It is, We need to fight even harder against our critics, rather than we need to actually admit that we've screwed up in any number of circumstances, and we're actually going to take a hard look at it and make reforms. I mean, they don't even pay lip service to it. Remember, the New York Times, essentially, Dean Baquet, I think the executive editor at the time, maybe still the executive editor, said something about how, we kind of have a blind spot when it comes to religion. Okay, that's great, New York Times. So maybe should you add that as your sort of footnote to every single article that you write pertaining to religion? Like, they admitted their blind spot there, at least, but they're not admitting the myriad other blind spots in all these other areas. And it speaks to the fact that they have no desire to correct their mistakes because they haven't paid a price for it. And if they do pay a price for it from independent journalists, well, then they have to take out those independent journalists.
Yeah, that's their goal. And the goal of the independent journalists should be to build up an infrastructure that doesn't let them. And I think the market sort of demand for those independent journalists is helping them to do that, actually. And that's great. But nobody knows who to trust anymore. And that position is entirely reasonable. It's entirely reasonable. And that's what the corporate press doesn't get. They should have gotten it in 2015 and 2016. It is now 2021, and they understand it even less, even though we've gone through a pandemic. And the ones that do understand it actually blame the people who don't trust them on bigotry. Right. That's the explanation for why people could possibly not trust the New York Times. It's not that, or the Washington Post. It's not that they've gotten stories wrong time after time after time and seem to make no course corrections. It's that everyone is bigoted and they're sort of a toothless QAnon rube, chugging Mountain Dew. So on that happy note.
A pox on every house. And I kind of feel like that's every single day in this crazy media, political, ruling class landscape that we're living in. A pox on every house.
Yeah, and we'll be back on Friday to talk more about this. I think the Tucker story would be a fantastic one to cover then. So I look forward to chatting with Ben about that again. So we do this every Wednesday and every Friday. Please tune in. We're live in the morning. We would appreciate it if you subscribed and stayed posted for all of our episodes where we go through the worst media misbehavior of the week. We think that's important, and we think it's an important way to build up other institutions that are sort of stepping into this vacuum. So with that, I'm Emily Jashinsky. He's been Weingarten. We will be back with more bad news soon.